Welcome to lecture number 73. This is historical topic 7.5, World War I, Military and Diplomacy. The theme is America and the World. This is the first of two lectures on World War I. Today we'll cover the progression of the war abroad, and the next lecture will cover what it was like in the United States on the home front. The learning objective is explain the causes and consequences of U.S. involvement in World War I. The first key concept talks about the U.S. entry into World War I. After initial neutrality in World War I, the nation entered the conflict, departing from the U.S. war and policy tradition of non-involvement in European affairs. This tradition of non-involvement, the key concept refers to, is Washington's farewell address in the Third Historical Period. While the United States followed a policy of non-involvement with European affairs, it was more willing to involve itself in the Western Hemisphere. That's an important distinction to make so that this key concept doesn't make you think that the U.S. was completely an isolationist country. The primary reason for why the U.S. entered the conflict was Germany's unrestricted submarine warfare. The United States continued to trade with Great Britain during the conflict, and Germany tried to keep goods from reaching Britain by implementing a submarine blockade. As a side note, Britain had implemented their own blockade on Germany that limited the importation of almost all goods, including food. American merchant ships carrying war materials and sometimes even merchant ships carrying foodstuffs were at risk of being torpedoed by submarines. When Britain began hiding war materials in passenger ships, even more people were endangered. The first incident of American lives lost was when the British passenger ship, the Lusitania, was sunk with some Americans on board. Germany continued to target passenger ships, and American diplomatic pressure finally succeeded in yielding concessions after the sinking of the French passenger ship, the Sussex. Germany's Sussex Pledge promised that German U-boats would give warning to any ship carrying war supplies before it would sink it. By January 1917, Germany believed that they were close to winning the war and could do so in about 6 months if they were able to resume unrestricted submarine warfare. To hedge against American interference, Germany made diplomatic overtures to Mexico in the Zimmermann telegram. They promised Mexico that if they attacked the U.S., they would have Germany's help in regaining lost territory from the 1845 Mexican-American War. The telegram was intercepted and decoded by the British and presented to the U.S., and it was enough for Woodrow Wilson to ask for Congress to declare war. There was a mixture in sentiment at home. Some Americans supported going to war and some didn't. A preparedness movement had been responsible for an increasing of military production in the event that the U.S. did enter the war. Wilson ran on the campaign slogan, "He kept us out of war," in 1916. He had made the case to the American people that he should be reelected because he kept the peace, though he continued to build up America's war machine and eventually entered the war. Shortly after his second inaugural address, he asked Congress for a declaration of war, and the U.S. was officially in. The second half of that key concept continues. The nation entered the conflict in response to Woodrow Wilson's call for the defense of humanitarian and democratic principles. In Wilson's declaration of war, he frames this endeavor in a moral way. He says that the submarine attacks were attacking democracy as a whole. He said that this was warfare against mankind and the world must be made safe for democracy. At the same time that Congress approved the declaration for war, the Bolshevik Revolution began in Russia, which caused the Russians to exit the war. The map on the right side shows the territorial gains from the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Russia gives up a lot of territory that is now present-day Eastern Europe and mostly Ukraine. Now Germany has the ability to focus all of its resources on the Western Front of the war. The Western Front included most of Eastern France and Belgium. They were scarred by trench warfare, and the progression of the war had been stalled there since the first year of the war. The aerial photograph on the screen shows what those trenches looked like. Each belligerent had trenches dug parallel to their opponents with an area between called no man's land. The area got its name from the vulnerable position it put soldiers in when they attempted an attack on the opposing trench. With Russia's exit, Germany was able to focus more resources on the Western Front. There was a real fear that they would now be able to push through that trench warfare and occupy Paris, leading to a German victory. The next key concept covers the role that American forces played on the outcome of the war. Although the American expeditionary forces played a relatively limited role in combat, the United States' entry helped to tip the balance of the conflict in favor of the Allies. The American Expeditionary Forces, or the AEF, were led by General John J. Pershing. At first, their task was to plug the holes along the Western Front to keep Germany from finding a weak spot and getting through. Eventually, they're responsible for an entire section of the Western Front and repelling the last offensive by the Germans at the Second Battle of the Marne. The map on the bottom left shows how close the Germans were to actually getting to Paris. The AEF were also involved in the campaign of the Meuse-Argonne Forest. It started in September of 1918 and continued until the armistice was signed in November 1918. The AEF was still segregated. Black troops and white troops did not fight together. It's a bit of an uncomfortable topic for the United States because supposedly they're fighting to uphold democracy and other moral causes, yet at the same time they're practicing segregation within their own troops. Finally, on November 11, 1918, an armistice stopped the fighting. The United States, because of the limited amount of time that they spent fighting the war, had fewer troops die as casualties, and more troops died of disease. The Spanish flu was a global pandemic. You've probably never heard of anything similar to this, but it was an influenza virus that was easily transmitted and reached all the different parts of the world. It was called the Spanish flu because it was only reported by the Spanish press, since all the other powers fighting the war were censoring their newspapers. The casualties for the pandemic were estimated between 25 and 50 million people. The Treaty of Versailles is the ultimate peace treaty at the end of the war, and the last key concept covers its contents, and it starts by telling us that Wilson was deeply involved in the post-war negotiations for war. Wilson met with the leaders of the other Allied countries, and they end up being called the Big Four. The other three are George Clemenceau from France, Lloyd George from Britain, and Vittorio Orlando from Italy. The Versailles Conference ends up being less of a peace negotiation, and instead it's the Allied powers setting the terms for the peace. Wilson goes in with an idealistic agenda that he had presented to Congress called the 14 Points. He calls for things like freedom of the seas, so he doesn't want more submarines threatening commerce. Arms reductions to try and put a cap on the militarism that had led to the war in the first place. Self-determination for parts of Europe that had been conquered by Germany and other imperial holdings. And again, this was somewhat ironic since the United States had recently become an imperial power themselves with holdings in the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam. Other provisions of the 14 Points included an end to secret treaties, and finally his most important point was to create a League of Nations. This would be a multinational organization that would be responsible for arbitrating international disagreements and keeping the peace. In the actual negotiations, most of Wilson's points are ignored. Wilson was willing to concede on almost everything except his idealistic plan for the League of Nations. The League is approved with a clause in its charter on collective security for its members. This means that if one of the members of the League is attacked, the other members will come to the defense of that country. This ends up holding up the ratification process in the United States. The rest of the negotiations were really vindictive and were trying to take revenge on Germany for all the destruction that they were supposedly causing. One of the articles explicitly places the responsibility of the war on Germany and sets financial reparations that Germany must pay. Since Germany doesn't have enough money to pay for them, they start paying for reparations with their industrial supplies, which will limit their ability to pay for their reparations. Later on, they're just going to print more money and pay them with inflated currency. It leads to a longer period of economic instability in an environment that will be ripe for a leader like Hitler to exploit and rise to power. The last part of the key concept says the United States Senate refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles or join the League of Nations. Republicans in Congress were angered by the lack of input in the negotiations. Remember, Wilson was a Democrat, and he was the first Democrat that was elected since Grover Cleveland, and then before Grover Cleveland, there hadn't been another Democrat that was elected since before the Civil War. Woodrow Wilson's also the first Democrat from the South to be elected since the Civil War, and Wilson doesn't take any Republicans with him to the negotiations in Versailles, so they feel completely shut out. The Republicans were split up into two different factions. There were the Irreconcilables and the Reservationists. Based on the name, you can tell that the Irreconcilables did not feel that there was anything that could be changed within the treaty or the peace agreement to where they would vote in favor of the League of Nations. The Reservationists were led by Henry Cabot Lodge. They thought that if the collective security clause of the League of Nations was taken out, they would be in favor of the treaty. Wilson did not want to budge on anything related to the League, so he tries to build national support and then have the American people pressure their senators to vote in favor of it. While he's on a speaking tour, he collapses and suffers a stroke, and it leaves him severely limited for the rest of his term. The Senate ultimately rejected the Treaty of Versailles and rejected the League of Nations. The United States won't have a formal peace with Germany until after Wilson leaves office in 1921. And finally, for the recap. The U.S. enters the war to make the world safe for democracy. The AEF made the difference in the fighting despite Germany looking to focus its efforts on the Western Front. And Wilson had high hopes for the Treaty of Versailles, though negotiations went poorly and the U.S. Senate finally rejected the treaty. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, you can click the video link on the screen. And if you're looking for more practice to help you on the AP exam, you can visit apushslides.com. I wish you the very best in all of your studying and look forward to seeing you back in the next lecture.